Welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, in which we take a deeper look at the topic of focus or the passage from the previous weekend. We are in our United Together series, where we are looking at Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians. And this previous weekend, our topic was United in Differences. And so my name is Brad. I'm joined by Chris Banser, St. Charles campus pastor.
Yes.
Chris, how are you doing?
Good. I am going on vacation this Friday, so I'm excited for that. Excited to do a deep dive before I leave for the Great White North.
You going to Canada?
I am going to Canada, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Doing some fishing?
Doing some fishing.
On the boundary waters?
Doing some lake activity.
All right.
So I will encounter mosquitoes that are the size of a bird and try to fend them off. And had to get a deep dive in before I left.
Yeah, cool. How's the fantasy baseball team looking?
Fantasy baseball team's doing pretty good. I'm in first right now, but I have had a recent dip in form in the last week or two, so my lead is not as large as it once was.
Yeah, but you've been that top 3 or 4 like all season.
Yeah.
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 All right, well, this deep dive, though, is not about fantasy baseball, although maybe a future episode of deep dive will be.
For subscribers. This one's free.
This one's free. Yes. Yeah. For subscribers on our Patreon account, you can. We don't have that. Everything's free here at Calvary. Okay. So united in differences. That's the idea.
Yes.
So the first week, united in the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of focused on some of the earlier chapters. Even in our last week of a deep dive, we talked about, okay, what does wisdom look like?
Yeah.
The wisdom of the cross, the foolishness of man. Now we're into chapters like 8, 9, 10. And so one of the difficulties with a project like this, it's a 6-week message series, and yet 1 Corinthians has more than 6 chapters. There's more than 6 things going on. And so how do we pick and choose yet still be faithful to the message that Paul is writing? And so in Corinthians, a very diverse church, lots of differences, socioeconomic backgrounds. We covered a little bit of that in the context of just like where Corinth was situated on an isthmus in between the Adriatic and the Aegean Seas. You had a major trade route go through, and so a lot of people, a lot of customs, a lot of activity, a lot of different backgrounds coming through here, and the church was no exception. This was present there as well. And so what does it look like to be united in spite of differences, because of differences, in differences?
With differences.
With differences.
I think with differences is what I roll with. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Okay, say more about that.
Yeah, I think it's with differences because the differences are actually not always sin or things that are to be avoided. Actually, at times, they are things to be tremendously celebrated because our God is not boring. He has not designed and created and wired us to be of complete uniformity. How bleak would that be? And the picture we actually get of the New Jerusalem is that of every tongue, tribe, and nation, which is actually quite beautiful. So I think united with differences is good vocabulary. Now, sometimes our differences are because of our own folly, our own pettiness, and we wouldn't celebrate those things. But united in Christ with the Holy Spirit is going to bring a massively diverse people from many different backgrounds, from many different ways and areas of life with different goals and aspirations. But when they're united together under the centrality of the cross, there's actually a diversity that's celebrated. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be in spite of the differences necessarily. Yeah.
That's good. I want to do 2 things in this discussion. I want to be faithful to 1 Corinthians, specifically chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Yep.
If we have time, we can maybe backtrack a little bit and look at 6 and 7, because there's a lot of fun stuff there too.
Yeah.
But then also the discussion of, well, what should we divide over?
Yes.
Right? Because those are 2 kind of related but separate things. So first, though, unpack this food, offered to idols argument that Paul is making in chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Yeah. So food is sacrificed to idols everywhere in Corinth. You can't avoid it.
Can't avoid it.
Like it's where it comes from. It's
like
in the marketplace.
It's like going to the grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we understand it because most of us don't actually farm our own food. So like you can't avoid purchasing something that's maybe been sacrificed to an idol. So Paul's saying those of you who are theologically a little more advanced know that really these things are just sacrificed to the figment of human imagination. But weaker Christians or those who are not quite as theologically developed, or they're newer Christians, they might not understand this. So it might be a real stumbling block. They might see someone who led them to faith eat a ribeye that's sacrificed to Mars, and now they're like, oh my goodness, what is this person doing? Are they worshiping Mars? So Paul's saying, heck, I'll be a vegetarian if I have to, if it means that I'm not going to make one of my brothers or sisters in Christ stumble. So that's the issue of meat in public food and public eating, or even within a setting of a private home, is actually quite a contentious issue for the first century church at Corinth, because there are those who don't quite understand that there's Christian liberty in eating the meat because it's actually not sacrificed to anything at all, and just it's not going to affect your spirituality to eat that meal.
Yeah. Do we when I read passages like this, and this probably is not the right frame of mind to have.
Yes.
When I read passages like this, what I want to do is, okay, well, which of the groups is better? Like which group do I want to be part of? And I think probably in reality, depending on different situations, sometimes I fall into one and sometimes I fall into another. But so anyway, what do we do? How do we faithfully read a passage like this? And then do we have any, I don't know, modern day examples of like this? I mean, maybe not to this level, but like any common application for us with it?
Well, I think there's a ton of modern day examples. Let's take like beer for one, right? Like, let's just go down that road.
All right, let's do it.
So
you heard it here first.
So within a framework of Christian liberty, like if you don't struggle with this temptation or addiction to alcohol, like within our theological denomination and framework, like you have the freedom to drink a beer, right? But if you have a brother or sister where like that's going to convict their conscience, or it's going to be a stumbling block, or maybe their history and there's addiction, or there's close family members that were alcoholics and there was trauma there, like in any of that, like you would avoid it for their sake. Like it's an awareness, it's a love, it's a kindness towards neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that their conscience is the law over your life, but it is to say their conscience determines the way you love their life.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's a sticky statement right there.
Yeah. Why?
Did you use that this weekend?
I didn't. Why didn't I think about that a couple days ago?
Where was that?
Maybe we'll have an excuse to bring it back later in Corinthians. But so that's kind of what Paul's saying is wield your knowledge in love. It's not that their conscience is the law over your liberty.
Yeah.
But he's saying, I'll be a vegetarian if it's going to cause someone else to stumble.
Yeah. What do we do with the words like weak and strong?
Yeah.
Because like one of those feels a lot better than the other.
Yeah. So I think in this context, when we look at that word weak, we can say newer, or it's not necessarily that this person is a horrible Christian. They might just be fresh out of the blocks. Like they might have been a convert a couple weeks ago. Like they're still wrestling with a whole life lived where what they ate was in worship explicitly or implicitly to whoever, right? Apollos, or like whatever god that was in that temple situation. So the irony is, the really sad irony that we get to is that the stronger Christians are not wielding their knowledge with love, and in that they're actually displaying their immaturity when they think they're displaying their maturity. I mean, that's kind of the
really
cut back. That's kind of the sad irony of the whole situation.
Yeah. I think I was talking to Dan earlier this week, and he used the phrase, those with fragile faith.
Yeah.
Because like fragile is something that, again, has a weaker connotation, but there's like precious things are fragile too. And I thought that was a really good wordsmithing of the argument that Paul, that he was making.
Yeah.
Well, what about, okay, so in this particular situation, we're talking about things that were divisive for Christians in this particular church. In John 17, Jesus calls, he prays for unity in the future church. Unity is something that is fleeting. It's something that, though, is very connected to the message of the gospel. And yet, culturally speaking, very divided world, very polarized. We see this in churches too. We see this amongst churches. So I guess my question is, if unity is such an important thing, why so many churches? Why so many denominations? And like for us, like what should we divide over?
Yeah. So let's take the first part of that together first. Let's say denominations. Why is there a million denominations? Well, sometimes it's out of our own folly, our own foolishness. Like sometimes there are legitimate schisms and divisions that happen over things that are secondary at best, right? Maybe even more tertiary, whether that's, I don't know, music style or whatever. So we would say in some ways it's mistake, maybe even go so far to say is maybe it's potentially even sin, where we haven't loved our brothers and sisters well. But I do also think there's a category of different strategy, same mission. So the expression of the church in St. Charles County, Missouri, stylistically, probably has to be a bit different than that of Uganda or South Korea or Finland, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, you're talking about same mission, goals, values, unity. Stylistically, it just looks very different because it's a different strategy, and it's actually no folly or sin involved.
Yeah.
So I think we need to account for that too.
Yeah. So what, what should churches divide over?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
strategy would be one thing.
Yes. Yeah, strategy. I also think there's grounds for reforms and divisions over what Lewis might call mere Christianity, right? Like we have to hold stylistically secondary issues as if they are secondary. But if the gospel's abandoned, I mean, if the centrality of the cross in Christ is forsaken and it goes outside the bounds of what we would call historical orthodoxy within Christianity, which even that's a bit complicated, right? So I want to be fair there, but then I think that when the mission or the centrality of the cross, when the power is extracted from the Christian faith, and it becomes, I don't know, therapeutic moralistic deism or prosperity gospel, or you could name a million different kind of iterations, then at that point, that may be something we don't want to be a part of.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think what Paul in 1 Corinthians constantly does is he's constantly redirecting the focus away from the division, away from these other things, and towards the cross, towards the gospel, towards the work of Jesus and the Spirit in the lives of the church for the mission, because it matters. I do wonder, earlier you were talking about how there's beauty in diversity.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we celebrate diversity for diversity's sake alone, but there is beauty in diversity's sake. Like when we get to heaven, it's not going to look just like what our churches look like.
No.
For right now.
Yeah.
And so I guess I don't know, author Scott McKnight, he has a book called A Celebration of Difference. Difference, Differents.
Okay.
So he was describing not a celebration, a fellowship of difference.
Okay.
And basically using it as a picture for what the church truly is. It's a fellowship of people who are different, fundamentally different backgrounds, different historical contexts, different points in time, different preferences, all these different things. And that's truly what makes the church unique, in that I think we see in other religions or other faiths, it's all about this uniformity rather than unity.
Yeah.
And yet Christianity stands unique in that it's, hey, no, bring your diversity, bring your different preferences, bring these things that, what have you, and yet we're called to unity.
Yeah. So, yeah, at the risk of being kind of offensive here, let's look at Christianity globally. Let's just throw Antarctica and Australia off the map. Just throw them off the map for a second. If you look at the other 5 continents, it's almost a 20-20-20-20-20 split percent for Christianity.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen by mistake from a faith that originally from primarily Jewish people, and then primarily Roman diaspora people, and then almost exclusively Greco-Roman people, and then that expands out. Whereas when you look at other major religions in the world, it's not to say they don't have adherents on other continents from their original birthplace, but the ratios aren't even within a sniff of Christianity. I mean, they're much more tied to their birthplace of origin. And here's why this is, other major world religions will have politics and cultural values that are actually ingrained to that faith, where in Jesus we have someone that actually throws off all political expectations and like cultural norms and says, I want nothing to do with this. Like, I want the gospel to be everywhere, despite whatever the political system is. So yeah, that's interesting. Now, the pushback may be, well, there's someone like the Buddha who is similar to Jesus in that political expectations are thrown off. But even with Buddhism, we would say the centrality of that faith is nearly exclusively tied to its birthplace, unlike Christianity.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yet, how often in our churches do we want to just find people who are like us, who look like us, who sing like us? And it's hard. It's hard. Okay, well, we have about 5 to 10 more minutes. I want to backtrack a little bit and look at chapters 4. Really chapters 5, 6, and 7, because we're not going to hit on these specific things in our message series on the weekends, at least.
Yeah.
And so in chapter 5, you have Paul talking about sexual immorality in the church. In chapter 6, you have Paul speaking about or against Christians taking other, filing lawsuits against other believers, which is probably the one I want to talk about maybe the most, because I think there's some interesting questions and dynamics it brings up for the moment culturally that we're in.
Okay.
And then in chapter 7, he talks about marriage, and specifically, he goes into talking about singleness as well. So where do you want to start in those 3?
I guess let's just start with lawsuits.
Yes, let's start with the lawsuits. So his argument here, and again, we only have a few minutes. We don't even have a time to do a whole sermon here. You have Christians who were taking other Christians to court. And Paul says, hey, stop that. Why would he say stop that?
Well, legally they have the right to. They're Roman citizens, most of them. So it's not like they're out of line there. And yet, how does that look? I mean, to take your brother or sister, to drag them into court, not a great witness for the other Greco-Roman people that are in your major city observing this new faith that is Christianity. So it's not as if though they might not have had the legal right to. They're not technically breaking a law necessarily. But again, it's wielding their knowledge not in love, and it's tearing down brother and sister.
Yeah, so it's hurting the mission. But also, like, there's something to be said. Like, Paul has just made this argument, we talked about last week, of what wisdom is, right? Wisdom is the cross, and that's the foolishness of man. So, like, who are you to take your dispute and go allow others who don't share a common starting foundation for what even wisdom is and letting them enact a ruling that's not marked by the grace of the cross? Now, here's where I think it gets interesting. The cultural moment that we live in, especially within the church, like, we're coming out of the Me Too movement, maybe not coming out of it, maybe we're still in it. There's different reports that come from different churches of high cultural awareness standings in the country of, well, what do you do in the church world when you come across like unlawful activity? Like, what's our responsibility as ministers? And it probably depends on what the activity is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what the activity is. And I would say our responsibility as Christians is never self-preservation.
Yeah.
I think that's where we end up in a really horrible spot, is when self-preservation is the largest value and other values that should be preeminent then get swept aside. And the irony is that wicked ways of self-preservation, like, always get revealed in the end.
Yeah.
And so then the thing that you thought you were gaining really is never gained. And now you've unlovingly, unkindly discriminated or abused or whatever your brother and sister.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good, Chris. I appreciate you saying that. All right. Well, we're going to move quickly. So this next topic, sexual immorality, and then he kind of talks about sexual immorality, and then he jumps after the lawsuit to specifically marriage and singleness. What I want to do is talk more about his charge to singleness there.
Yeah. He likes singles.
He does. He loves them. Loves singles. And I don't know, maybe I'm just throwing this out there. This might even deserve a bonus episode of the deep dive at some point. Coming back to just...
For the Patreon subscribers.
Yeah, the Patreon subscribers.
With fantasy baseball.
It'd be great. Very eclectic conversation. No, I would love to do a conversation in the future just on Paul's ever-changing, like, view, not even changing views on marriage, but his instruction for marriage. And then I think where this plays is the sexual ethic of our day and how that's connected to marriage, because we are in, where we are. It's a different moment culturally than the 90s and the early 2000s, where you had your True Love Waits movement and Silver Ring thing and all these other really good-natured, intentioned, and yet also very shameful and harsh movements, legalistic movements. So yeah, we'll do a bonus episode because like I said, we want to do justice to 1 Corinthians as a whole, and these arguments are happening here. But yeah, what's Paul have to say for the singles?
That they belong. Yeah, I mean, in some ways we are way more sexualized today than the ancient world could have imagined, as we have massive billboard advertisements with nudity as you drive down the highway. But in other ways, there was a wide diversity of sexual orientations and identities in the ancient world. It's not like
a new thing.
It's not a new thing. It really is not. And so Paul is interacting with a diverse array of identities and preferences and setups, whether it be singleness, marriage, polygamy exists in the ancient world quite commonly. So,
and in their context, he's also very clear, like, hey, stop having sex with your in-law. Like,
that's bad.
That's not good.
Not good, Corinthians. Yes. So anyway, but I would say above all else, we'll put more on the bonus episode, but Paul would say singles belong, which sometimes our local churches fail to reinforce.
Yeah. Why is that?
I think a bit culturally, and it's seeped into the church, like, and don't get me wrong, families should be incredibly valued. Like, I do believe they are a core unit of the church, but they're not the only core unit of the local church. And so we've just got to be aware, maybe we're even at times a bit idolatrous of the picture-perfect family.
Well, even Paul, right? Like, we talk about him as a, he's Jewish education and heritage. He's ethnically Jewish. We talk about him as a Roman citizen and what that allowed him to do. We talk about him and his Greek, he's Greek cultured brain, and yet we don't often throw in he was also a single guy.
Yeah.
And like he's pretty clear that he was only able to do what he was able to do for God's mission because he was single.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So anyway, cool. Well, thank you, Chris, for this discussion. I aspire to catch you in our fantasy baseball rankings. I don't
Good luck.
know. It's
6 spots back, baby.
I know it's not looking good. But anyway, yes, you can stay tuned for a upcoming bonus episode of the deep dive where we will kind of just look at this chapter 6 and 7 a little bit more closely. Again, you can find this resource and more on our website, calvary.church/resources, past deep dives, other book recommendations as well. If you have any questions or if there's anything that you'd love to see us tackle in a future episode, you can always email us at podcasts@calvary.church, and we will catch you again next week. Hope that you have a fantastic week. Go in grace and peace.
See you guys.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.